In the summer of 1950, the Korean War was days away from disaster. United Nations forces were cornered, outnumbered, and running out of ground. Seoul had fallen, defenses were collapsing, and the last line of resistance was pressed against the sea. From the outside, defeat looked inevitable. But behind closed doors, a plan was taking shape that many officers openly called insane. It involved attacking where no one would expect, landing where geography itself seemed like an enemy, and risking the entire war on a single move. If it failed, there would be no second chance. If it worked, everything would change. Why would anyone gamble on an operation mocked by naval experts and dismissed by the enemy? And how did desperation turn into audacity, and audacity into surprise? To understand how everything changed, we have to go back to the moment ambition outran reality. In 1950, the Korean War erupted at a moment of deep contradiction for the United States. Politically, Washington had embraced a global role as the leader of the non-communist world. Militarily, however, the country was unprepared for a sudden conventional war. After World War II, rapid demobilization and aggressive budget cuts had hollowed out U.S. forces. Units were undermanned, undertrained, and equipped with a mix of aging World War II material and untested systems. When war broke out on the Korean Peninsula, American soldiers arrived piecemeal, often lacking combat readiness and cohesion. This mismatch between strategic ambition and military reality defined the early phase of the conflict. Cold War logic intensified the stakes. The invasion of South Korea was interpreted not as a local conflict, but as a test case for communist expansion. The recently released National Security Council document NSC 68 framed global politics as a zero-sum struggle, demanding resistance wherever communism advanced. Failure in Korea, many feared, would echo far beyond Asia. Yet the doctrine of containment ran ahead of actual capability. The U.S. military was expected to halt aggression while still reorganizing itself for a new era of warfare, creating a dangerous gap between policy and power. That gap became brutally clear in June 1950. North Korean forces crossed the 38th parallel with speed and coordination, overwhelming South Korean defenses almost immediately. Seoul fell within days. Poorly prepared American units, rushed in from Japan, were unable to stem the advance and suffered repeated defeats. By August, United Nations forces were pushed into the southeastern corner of the peninsula, compressed into what became known as the Pusan Perimeter. This defensive line, anchored along the Nakdong River, represented the last stand. There was nowhere left to retreat. Inside the perimeter, survival depended on resolve and logistics. Lieutenant General Walton Walker issued stark orders to his troops. There would be no more withdrawals. The mentality was simple: stand or die. Constant North Korean attacks battered the line, sometimes breaking through, only to be pushed back by rapid redeployment of reserves along interior lines. Supplies streamed through the port of Pusan, buying time but not certainty. To observers around the world, the situation appeared hopeless. Defeat seemed only a matter of weeks. It was against this backdrop that the idea of landing at Inchon emerged and was ridiculed. Militarily, Inchon was everything an amphibious assault should avoid. Tidal variations reached nearly 10 meters, exposing vast mudflats and limiting landing windows to a few hours per day. The approach channel was narrow, winding, and easily defensible. Woolme Island dominated the harbor, offering an ideal position for artillery to annihilate landing forces. Even if troops got ashore, the port facilities were inadequate to sustain a major operation. Naval commanders compiled lists of objections. Rear Admiral James Doyle famously remarked that Inchon possessed every conceivable and natural handicap. Alternative sites were proposed: safer beaches, better logistics, fewer risks. From a conventional planning perspective, Inchon was a gamble bordering on recklessness. Precisely because of these disadvantages, North Korean command discounted it entirely. The assumption was simple: no rational enemy would choose such a place. That assumption would soon prove fatal. If you're enjoying this kind of story, take a moment to support the channel. Leave a like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because from here on, the war stops being about survival and becomes about a gamble no one believed would work until it did. In late summer 1950, the United Nations command was fighting with its back to the sea, and that pressure infected every discussion about risk. In Washington, senior leaders looked at the map and saw a single fragile lifeline: keep the Pusan perimeter intact. Anything that pulled combat power away from that line felt like a gamble, with the entire war as the stake. So when MacArthur pushed Inchon again, the initial reaction was blunt disbelief. The Joint Chiefs feared a double disaster: losing at Pusan while also losing at sea. The objections were not philosophical. They were technical, geographic, and logistical. Inchon's tidal range reached roughly 10 meters, leaving landing beaches usable only a small slice of each day. The approach required ships to navigate a narrow, twisting channel, with Woolmi Island sitting like a gun platform in the center of the harbor. The port itself lacked the infrastructure to sustain a large force after landing. To many commanders, it looked like a plan designed to fail. MacArthur heard all of it and refused to yield. What MacArthur offered instead was a theory of shock. He argued that the KPA had committed practically the entire force to smashing the perimeter in the south, leaving the Inchon, Seoul area weakly held. He insisted that only a strike near Seoul could cut North Korean supply and communication lines at their most vulnerable point. And he wanted that psychological prize: a reclaimed capital, a restored prestige, a public reversal of the narrative of retreat. The point wasn't merely to survive. It was to flip the war's momentum in one move. To sell the plan, MacArthur leaned into a core premise: surprise could substitute for comfort. Inchon's very disadvantages could become camouflage, because no rational enemy would expect an amphibious assault there. In conferences where naval experts cataloged hazards, he argued that caution would sacrifice the decisive effect. The record captures that stubborn certainty in his rhetoric. He framed the landing not as a calculated probability, but as a strategic necessity. The plan's boldness was not a side effect, it was the weapon. The operation opened with violence meant to clear the path and blind the defender. After preparatory fires on September 14th, the first wave hit on September 15, 1950, timed precisely to the tides that made Inchon infamous. Marines seized Woolmi Island early, eliminating the harbor's key defense position and neutralizing artillery threats that could have turned the channel into a kill zone. Then the tide fell hard, stripping water away and exposing mudflats, forcing the assault to pause until the next window arrived. Inchon's geography dictated tempo, but now that tempo belonged to the attackers. When evening tides returned, additional forces landed along the waterfront, expanding the beachhead with surprising speed. Instead of the fierce resistance planners feared, the defenders reacted slowly and unevenly. Reports and later assessments emphasized how thoroughly the North Koreans were caught off guard. Mines were limited, resistance was relatively light, and the defense lacked the layered readiness expected at a critical port near the capital. The mocked landing had achieved its first objective before the enemy could even decide what it was seeing. Surprise had arrived not as an abstract concept, but as a physical fact. The real damage, however, was not confined to Inchon's shoreline. Seoul was a logistical nerve center, and MacArthur's concept aimed at its arteries. By driving from Inchon toward the capital, UN forces threatened the routes feeding the KPA's southern armies and the communications tying the campaign together. This was the logic of envelopment. If the KPA had pushed deep into the peninsula, its supply lines had stretched, and stretched lines can be cut. MacArthur's own words captured the obsession. Armies collapse when supply lines are severed, and he intended to do exactly that. This is where the hammer and anvil picture became real. X-Corps formed the anvil in the enemy rear, while the 8th Army at Pusan was supposed to become the hammer driving north. With Inchon secured and forces moving inland, the KPA faced the nightmare it had dismissed: a deep strike behind its front. The psychological effect compounded the logistical one. A force that had advanced confidently now had to pivot, improvise, and retreat under pressure, often without coherent command direction. When the capital itself became contested again, confidence began to fracture. Seoul did not simply fall. North Korean command reacted by diverting forces to reinforce the city, swelling resistance into a harder fight than the clean operational diagrams predicted. Accounts describe roughly 20,000 North Korean troops in and around Seoul as reinforcements arrived, turning the advance into a grinding battle for crossings, ridgelines, and neighborhoods. Marines still pushed forward, but the cost rose quickly. What began as an audacious maneuver threatened to become a brutal urban contest, where every block could consume time, and time was the one resource MacArthur's schedule could not spare. Inside UN command, tension sharpened around that clock. Major General Edward Amon pressed Major General Oliver Smith to accelerate, seeking to meet political and symbolic deadlines for retaking the capital. Smith resisted reckless speed, believing that rushing would mean unnecessary casualties and tactical vulnerability. Amon's pressure led to changes, including drawing additional army units into the Seoul fight, and later accounts emphasized the friction and micromanagement that emerged during these days. The battlefield wasn't only streets and hills, it was also command relationships under strain, trying to reconcile tempo with survivability. The combat itself became the kind of close-range, destructive struggle that can't be faked by optimism. Descriptions compare the intensity of some Seoul fighting to Iwo Jima intensity, emphasizing how quickly the urban environment punished attackers. From late September, pockets of North Korean troops fought from barricades and street positions, firing from behind improvised defenses. Even after MacArthur publicly declared Seoul liberated on September 25th, fighting continued in earnest. Smith worried about lingering enemy holdouts capable of disrupting high-profile ceremonies. Seoul's liberation was a process, not a switch. Yet the strategic clock still favored the landing force, because Inchon had already forced the KPA into an operational crisis. The 7th Infantry Division went ashore and fanned south while Marines drove toward the capital. And by September 26th, an armored spearhead from the 8th Army linked up near Suwon, south of Seoul. The convergence mattered more than the map symbol. It meant the KPA's southern thrust had been cut and its retreat routes disrupted. In the aftermath, the KPA was described as completely shattered, no longer a cohesive force. The numbers underline how fast the collapse followed the shock. More than 125,000 prisoners fell into UN hands as North Korean survivors scattered northward through rugged terrain. Other casualty and prisoner figures cited for the Seoul fight itself point to heavy losses during the effort to hold the city. But the larger story was operational disintegration. A force built for rapid offensive movement suddenly found itself severed, overwhelmed, and unable to coordinate a coherent defense. Inchon didn't just win a battle, it collapsed a campaign design. And it did it in days. The landing at Inchon shattered a chain of assumptions that had guided North Korean command since the war began. Confidence born from rapid victories turned into rigidity. The belief that United Nations forces were incapable of bold maneuver, combined with the assumption that geography alone made Inchon impossible, created a blind spot. When the landing succeeded, that blind spot widened into a strategic collapse. Supply lines failed, command cohesion dissolved, and the psychological certainty that had powered the advance south evaporated almost overnight. What was mocked precisely because it seemed irrational became decisive because it defied expectation. At its core, Inchon reinforced an enduring principle of warfare. Surprise is not an accessory to strategy. It can be the strategy itself. MacArthur's operational design fused timing, geography, and tempo into a single disruptive blow. By striking where the enemy felt safest, the operation compressed decision-making cycles and overwhelmed North Korean command before it could adapt. MacArthur himself acknowledged the magnitude of the risk, accepting full personal responsibility if the landing failed. That willingness to stake reputation and career underscored how narrowly the operation balanced between catastrophe and triumph. Yet the legacy of Inchon carries a warning as sharp as its lesson. The stunning success bred a sense of invincibility at the highest levels of command. Confidence hardened into overreach. Within weeks, United Nations forces pushed north of the 38th parallel under the assumption that the enemy was finished. That assumption proved dangerously wrong. Chinese intervention transformed victory into a prolonged and brutal conflict, exposing how quickly success can distort judgment when caution is discarded alongside fear. Inchon demonstrated how to win initiative, but also how easily momentum can seduce leaders into miscalculation. President Harry S. Truman later praised the operation as a masterpiece of timing and execution, recognizing its role in saving the war from disaster. But Inchon's place in history rests not only on what it achieved, but on what it revealed. It showed how strategic audacity can reverse collapse, how mocked ideas can succeed when grounded in operational insight, and how victory itself can become dangerous when it silences dissent. The lesson endures. Wars are not decided by confidence alone, but by the ability to challenge assumptions before the enemy does.